Hey, Parkway Hills Youth. Thank you for joining us for another installment in our family reunion summer series. You may notice the background looks a little bit different because I'm at Millsaps College today to chat via Zoom with a Millsaps alumni who is now getting ready to study archaeology. Mason Shrader has joined us today to talk about his experience a little bit. Hey, Mason.
Hey, Jeff, how's it going?
Hey, pretty good. As good as it's going to go. How you
Yeah,
been?
that's right.
So first off, Mason, just introduce yourself to my students and just tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Mason Shrader. I am, as Jeff said, I'm an alum at Millsaps as of, almost 2 years now. Yeah, well, a year and a half or so. I am currently at Texas Tech University studying archaeology, specifically Greco-Roman archaeology. And I'm a disabled man. I have cerebral palsy, which we can get into the specifics of that in a bit. But basically, the short of it is that I talk kind of funny, as you might can hear, and I walk kind of funny with crutches. And so that's kind of my thing. Is that's informed a lot of my life, including my relationship to the church, which I've been in for all my life. I've been a member of some form of Christian church the entirety of my life. I've been specifically a part of the Methodist Church for about 4 years now. So yeah, that hasn't been a lifelong thing, but it's been a bit. It's been a while now, so I've enjoyed it. So yeah, that's kind of me.
Well,
Uh,
wonderful. So just you mentioned that it very much that that your experiences as a disabled person have affected your experience with the church. I have some specific questions I want to ask, but I'll go ahead and open the floor just to what is that? What has that meant for you? How has that affected your experience with the church and faith issues?
Yeah, so I mean, well, I'll take that one at a time. With the church as a whole, as like an institution, I would say that my disability is the number one metric that kind of makes or breaks a welcome experience for me at any given church. So my family, growing up, I have a brother who also has cerebral palsy. He's not quite like me. He's in a wheelchair instead of using crutches, so a little bit different. But we both have CP, and so growing up, when we would move to a new town or look for a new church or whatever, when we would go to a new church, we would always, like, the first couple minutes were always kind of that make or break moment,
Mm,
because we were not a forgettable kind of family. We would get a lot of stares when I was younger because two disabled kids kind of draws attention. And so I could immediately tell kind of if it was like welcoming stares, like oh, kind of immediate recognition of hospitality, or if it was kind of fear. And I would get that sometimes from churches. And so we would joke that kind of that opening 5 minutes was kind of the thing that we would say, is this church going to work or is it not? And it was very much due to kind of the way they initially looked at our disabilities. It also has to do with like that opening 5 minutes means that like we're looking to see if the sanctuary is accessible for my crutches and my brother's wheelchair. Like if we can actually get in the place, or if
mm.
there's too many stairs or something, right? That all kind of happens when we first walk up. And so that is kind of the moment for me still, even now going to church by myself, whenever I'm going to a new church. When I started going to new churches in Texas looking for my home church there, that was like the moment. I those first 5 minutes were still I still had to feel out, is this going to be a place where I'm stared at because I'm different and they're afraid of that? And is it going to be accessible or not? And so those questions always go through my head whenever I enter any new church. When it comes to like faith itself, as opposed to the less kind of institutionalized church, I think still my disability is like a central aspect. There's a lot of stories in the Gospels about Jesus and disabled people, and I study in the ancient world, so I know this pretty well. Disabled folks back in Jesus's time were very much kind of members of a marginalized community, and in a lot of ways, for a lot of the same reasons we still are, but even more so back then. And Jesus kind of spoke to that in a lot of very interesting and very cool ways, reaching out to individuals like me who lived in the past. And so at a very young age, I was able to very much see myself in the gospel, which is something I don't know a lot of people can do so young. But I mean, I remember being 5 and hearing all those stories about like the lame man being lowered down on a mat and being healed and all this, and kind of seeing myself in a lot of ways. And so that's been very influential for me in my faith, that touchstone of kind of Christ and disability. So I hope that it wasn't
Hey,
too
that's
rambling.
wonderful and really interesting, because you're right. A lot of us, particularly uh, if if we are able-bodied, or for a lot of us in churches in the West, if we are a little more affluent and not Jewish, yeah, it's hard. Like there are issues connected with trying to see ourselves in the stories in ways that maybe it's actually unfair to try to see ourselves in those stories,
Right.
because those stories, you bring up a good point, are probably there to remind us of of people who aren't like us, people who Jesus is reaching because we haven't reached.
Absolutely.
Um, so I also thought it was interesting you talked about how quickly you can kind of suss out that feeling of welcome.
Yeah.
Could you give us some kind of examples of what it means to, I've said this before with one of our previous interviews. You're not really going to find a whole lot of churches who just flat out tell you that someone isn't welcome.
Right.
Every church I've ever encountered ever says we are a welcoming church.
Absolutely.
The issue is, do you back that up? And so you can tell us a little bit about ways that hasn't come to fruition, or conversely ways that you really feel welcome and like you are invited to the table with everyone.
Yeah. So I mean, I mean, I talk a lot about accessibility and things like that, and that is in many ways kind of for a lot of us disabled folks, whether if you made an effort to make your church accessible, that is in and of itself kind of a statement of being welcoming, and not just, but truly welcoming, not that superficially you say you're welcoming but don't back it up. But it really, I mean, it's a little bit more than that, because I've actually been to churches that are not that accessible. A lot of very cool looking, very old Methodist church weren't made with me or people like me in mind per se. But but I've been to these churches and still felt welcome. And the important thing is the attitude about accessibility, I think. So I've these churches that I've been to a few now, where I've struggled to get in the door, quite literally physically struggled to walk up kind of steps and things like that. And it's not that I'm angry that those steps are there and there's not a ramp, and I'm saying that's not welcoming, because those, in several instances, people have come to me and apologized for that and said, I remember one in particular example of a person in Texas the church I go now, St. John's, came to me and they saw I was walking upstairs to go to a Bible study that was held upstairs, and they said to me, they said, "I'm so sorry that you're that we totally haven't thought of sort of our young adult Bible study needing to be accessible because not many people come and certainly not many disabled people. But if you would forgive us, we want to make sure this is accessible for you from now on. And so can we move it to the bottom to the first floor so you don't have to go up those stairs?" And so that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about, right? Where it's the actual building itself wasn't accessible. There wasn't an elevator or anything. I don't think my little church could really support that structurally. But it's the attitude of the people there that made it welcoming, right? For me as a disabled person. And that really is what accessibility is. It's kind of that attitude of saying, okay, we're gonna be creative about this because we want you in the building. It's not just building ramps and having elevators. It's figuring out ways to make things accessible even when you can't build ramps or elevators. Conversely, we had instances where the as a family kind of where the building itself was fairly accessible and open, but the again, it goes back to this kind of accessibility as attitude, right? The congregation was very standoffish generally towards this, and there have been a lot of times that we, especially when I was younger, that like the people would, in order for us to like sit all together as a family with Benjamin in the wheelchair, they would have they would have pews, right? But Benjamin obviously can't pull up into a pew.
Right.
And so instead, they were kind of like, well, you could just sit in the back with Benjamin. Um, and like that, on the one hand, I kind of understand that because they were not, they were saying, well, our pews aren't set up for accessibility. So on the one hand, that is kind of a physical thing, but on the other hand, again, it's about an attitude, right? And it's about creative thinking. And we were literally in the back, away from everybody else, and that even though they didn't meet the kind of minimal requirement of making their sanctuary accessible, it felt really bad, like we were away from everybody, and then afterwards, kind of nobody talked to us about it, and they were kind of ashamed of it, I think. But yeah, so it's again that attitude, right? Of well, we can just kind of stick them in the back, and that's what accessibility is, right? When in actuality, if you're sitting in the back all alone with just your family, and you don't want that, which nobody in my family did, it doesn't feel very welcoming, right? And so it felt, yeah, it felt bad. So that's a good example, kind of the converse, right? The attitude. It's all about the attitude. You can have any number of physical setups in your church for accessibility or lack of physical accessibility, but it really just boils down to a sort of mindset, which I guess maybe sound cliche, but it's very much
No,
true.
I think that's really helpful because I know I have thought about it this way before. That yeah, when you think about accessibility issues with just about anything, including church, I think it's really easy to naturally go to solely the physical things. And one thing I keyed in that was interesting that you described that church you visited that was very welcoming despite the lack of physical resources, was this attitude, and an attitude of humility and willing to talk to you about it, because I
Absolutely.
think it's easy to, and again, I can say this from my own personal experience thinking about these issues. I think it's easy to dwell on the physical for one thing, and it's easy to see it as a binary of, are you accessible or not? um, and that probably may not be the best attitude, because again, what was interesting in your example was that they had some physical structural issues, but the thing that you keyed in on and really seemed to drive home was that they were willing to say, hey, we hadn't thought about this before, we're sorry, let's work together on this. And that attitude posture of being welcoming, being so important. I think that's really interesting. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I see that as being very Christ-like, and I see that as well. I know that from my own experience and talking with other ministers, sometimes this fear of you have to either get it all right or you're wrong. But you just gave us a wonderful example of somebody who was willing to admit, hey, we messed up.
Yeah.
Let's get better.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's that kind of attitude that is the key. You hit the nail on the head. It's humility, and it's a willingness to say, let's get better. Because I'm always very careful about this. I like um, I've been to many small churches where they're kind of, every tithe is really just so important, and they're financially trying to make ends meet that way. And so adding, say, an elevator is really expensive. And so I'm always careful to say, to talk about the material conditions that are kind of we need to talk about when we talk about accessibility, and that it's not just the physical material. We have to think about the church in terms of attitude, because yeah, you can do these things without like breaking the bank on your church. You know what I mean? So I want to be accommodating to that as well. So that's kind of why I use that metric.
No,
Uh,
that's really helpful. So now the issue is with the main audience for this interview is that while my students will hopefully be in a position within a few years where they are, like it really is not that long until some of them are old enough to be, voting on church issues. Like if they're the church they're in college or after college is voting on a new building, being the one to say, hey, have we thought about
yeah,
ADA issues? But in the
absolutely.
and I'm glad that you're here to help start planting that seed now. But what's interesting is to me to get at is they're not there yet. So they've got some years before it's going to be here in a heartbeat.
Yeah, right.
But they're going to high school and middle school right now. Could you talk a little bit about how they can be right now, not when a couple of years from now when they're voting on budgets, but right now be good neighbors and good siblings to people with disabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, uh, obviously, yeah, things like physical church plans and things like that are gonna be. You can. I encourage everyone to, at any age, to sort of be informed of those things, so that eventually, when you do come of age to start making those decisions, you'll know what kind of decisions to make. So I do encourage even high schoolers to kind of read up on the ADA and see what it says. And it's actually not as boring of a proposition as that sounds, because there are some wild things that kind of people ignore about the ADA that like no one is doing right now. That it's kind of fun to see. Wow, this law is actually not being enacted anywhere. And so I think it's fun, but maybe I was a weird high schooler. So, but that aside, I think I had in when I was in high school, I had kind of two sides of church youth group. I had one from my parents' church, and one from kind of a group, a drama club I was in, that was a Christian drama club. That was really where I made most of my kind of church friends. And the one from my parents' group was not great, and here's why. Is because I distinctly remember there was one night we were worshiping, It was a Wednesday night service, so we were all kind of singing. It was before I was a Methodist, so it wasn't like a hymn or anything. It was like bad contemporary Christian rock music worship.
Mhm.
And I'm not into that, but regardless, it was one of those nights.
Yeah.
And I remember a couple people on the row behind us looked at my brother and I and started like uh, very loudly saying how grateful to God they were that they weren't disabled. Um, and this happened a couple times at this youth group. And it was a striking moment to me of like, one, they were so willing to talk about us, but not to us. Um, and this was kind of the story of that youth group is like we often became kind of token disabled people, but not like friends. Like no one really wanted to talk to us, just about us and at us and things like that. And so I think that's kind of the first thing I would say is like it is I think I see a lot of young people be scared of talking to disabled folks because you don't know if you're gonna say the wrong thing, if you sort of the classic example is like asking a disabled person to like run over here real quick, right? Like people are so worried about that kind of language around me. And it's so funny to me because if they actually talk to me, I don't care at all. Like yeah, I can't run, but like that's a colloquialism we use in English. Who cares? But like, and so I very much had this attitude in high school, but people were so afraid to talk to me for that kind of reason. For there's a saying in sort of disabled circles that is assume competence, and that is also what I would tell any high schooler to do. There's this kind of uh, regular occurrence among everyone, not just youth or high schoolers or college students, but everybody, to look at an individual with a disability and assume some sort of social, mental, cognitive incompetence. And that is just simply not true for really anyone with a disability, even those classified as cognitively disabled. Um, and so I think that's part of the fear. That was part of the fear of talking to me is that they didn't really know if I could converse with them like normal high schoolers do. And so what I would say is just assume that if they're in a youth group, that every disabled individual is competent enough to like contribute something to your social life, and so ask them to to be engaged in it. Just approach them and ask them on their own terms what they're cool with and what they're not cool with. I guarantee you, every disabled person I met will tell you what they're comfortable with you doing and what they're not comfortable with. And so you don't have to be afraid and walk on eggshells because we want to be involved in these places that we're in. You wouldn't see somebody there if they weren't. Now, the next thing I would say about that is, well, what if there are no disabled people in your youth group? Well, then that's a question of maybe start thinking about why that is. Do you know any disabled people? Period. And start thinking about why that is. Maybe maybe your church is doesn't present as welcoming towards disabled people. Maybe there are a lot of reasons, and these questions are sort of hard to answer, especially as youth students. But I've seen a lot of youth programs in my years kind of become aware of this and start reaching out to the community around their church and evolving people who were not in their congregation. So I think that's something that can very much be done. Um, but it's kind of hard to think about sometimes, and maybe to think about why that is difficult. But for disabled people, it usually comes down to, well, does this church seem opening or not? And like I said, in order to seem accessible, to seem welcome and open, it's all about that attitude, and it's all about sort of the way you present yourself. So I think these are all things that youth can do right now, to sort of start taking that stance.
And
Did that make any sense?
no, it absolutely 100% made sense. In fact, it fits perfectly. My last several interviews now have, no matter the demographic they're talking about, my last several interviewees have all said something to the effect of suspending your personal narratives of somebody else's life to get to know them.
Absolutely.
So I think it's awesome that you brought that up, because like I think it's really hopefully emerging to my students through these interviews that that's probably the key to bridging a lot of our gaps, whether it's ability issues or racial issues, financial issues. I think the core of a lot of this we keep coming back to in all these interviews is suspending that narrative that you project on other people long enough to actually ask them. And then the other component is you brought it up directly with the beginning with talking about that, again, that church in Texas that was welcoming in attitude. With, you brought up the converse. It feels to me like the converse side of that is you describe people being afraid because they're afraid to mess up. And yeah, it takes just I hope my students will take from this the idea that if they're trying to get to know somebody, regardless of who that other person is, that it's going to take being willing to apologize and being humble enough to admit that they don't have it all figured out, so they can actually have those conversations instead of waiting until they have it all figured out in order to talk to a person who isn't like them.
Yeah, because if you wait until that moment will never come, right? Like none of us have it all figured out. Um, as how to be completely Christ-like and compassionate to people 100% of the time. Like that's just not how this works, right? And so you gotta kind of, yeah, embrace that you're gonna have to be humble and you're gonna have to apologize. But I think that's not to get too uh preachy about it, which is kind of uncharacteristic of me, but I kind of think that's part of this whole grace idea, right? Is that we have to extend grace to each other, but I think we also have to extend grace to ourselves. That's part of humility. And that we are going to mess up, and that's okay. That's something I really struggle with. That's something that's very important when we're talking about experiences outside ourselves. And so, yeah.
That's wonderful. Mason, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with my students. You have really put us in a great position to talk about these issues, and I appreciate you. Best of luck with your studies. Best of luck with figuring out what's next in education with everything going on right now. That's going to be fun for all of us. Thank you. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. It was a blast.
Great. And Parkway Hills, don't forget, join us 7 p.m. on Zoom so we can talk about this as a youth group as we try to better figure out how to be a good family for everybody who's invited to the cross. I will see y'all Sunday night.